The Arab millionaire's laughter echoed like a thunderclap across the glass walls of his Manhattan penthouse. Expensive chandeliers trembled, and the city skyline twinkled beneath him as if applauding his arrogance. Hassan al-Mansuri leaned back in his leather chair, his tailored suit sharp enough to cut through silence. He stared at the boy standing before him, a boy too small for the vastness of this room, too plain for its opulence, too ordinary to belong here. 9 languages? Hassan repeated, his voice dripping with disbelief. Kid, you can barely string a sentence together in English. Don't embarrass yourself. The boy's name was David Johnson, 14 years old, son of a woman who scrubbed marble floors like these for men who never knew her name. His backpack, frayed at the edges, dangled from one shoulder, a silent reminder of the public school halls he came from. But his eyes, those steady, unblinking eyes, did not waver. He didn't flinch at the insult, though it burned hotter than fire. I said, David repeated, his voice steady despite the tremor in his chest. I speak 9 languages. The room fell silent for the first time. Hassan's smirk twisted into something darker, the kind of sneer that comes from men who believe money crowns them kings. Around him, other businessmen chuckled, whispering under their breath about the arrogance of children who dream too much. But David stood firm, his small figure etched against the towering windows, like a shadow that refused to bow. He remembered his mother's words that morning, spoken as she tied her work apron. They'll try to make you feel small. David, but remember, your mind is bigger than any room you walk into. Those words wrapped around him now, a shield no laughter could pierce. The tension grew thick, heavy like the velvet curtains brushing the floor. Hassan leaned forward, his gold watch catching the light. Prove it, he said, his voice low, dangerous, and amused. David inhaled slowly. He knew this moment could crush him, or crown him. His tongue moved like lightning, and suddenly the air filled with words. French, then Spanish, then Mandarin, each flowing seamlessly into the next. The businessmen froze, their laughter dying mid-breath. Italian rolled into German, then Swahili, and Arabic, the very language Hassan spoke, slid off his lips like silk. The boy stopped. Silence. The city outside seemed to lean closer. Hassan blinked once, then twice, his confidence cracking. The son of a cleaning lady had shaken his kingdom with nothing but words. The silence in the penthouse was deafening, the kind that made men accustomed to control shift uncomfortably in their seats. For years, Hassan al-Mansuri had lived in a world where wealth silenced dissent, where gold-plated authority commanded obedience. Yet now, a teenager with hand-me-down, shoes and afraid. Backpack had stolen the room with nothing more than breath and brilliance. One of the businessmen coughed into his fist, trying to disguise his shock. Another whispered in disbelief, "Did he really just—" The words trailed off, for the evidence was undeniable. David had spoken with the ease of rivers flowing into oceans, unbroken, unstoppable. Each language was a blade slicing through the arrogance that had filled the room only moments before. David's chest rose and fell, his heart pounding, but he didn't let it show. His mother's tired smile flashed in his memory, the way she had bent over so many nights, scrubbing floors, hands raw, whispering lessons from old books she had borrowed from the library. Words are your armor, David. Knowledge is your sword. He had listened. He had built himself piece by piece on the foundation of her sacrifices. Hassan forced a chuckle, though the sound lacked its earlier thunder. Parlor tricks, he muttered, waving a dismissive hand. Languages are nothing without power. What good are words if you have no stage to use them on? His companions nodded weakly, desperate to restore the balance of hierarchy. But cracks had already appeared. David's gaze didn't waver. Words, he said quietly, create the stage. The room shifted again. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but power had changed hands in that moment. The boy who should have been invisible was now undeniable. Still, Hassan leaned back, regaining composure. Fine, he said. Impressive. But do you think this makes you my equal? A janitor's son standing in front of kings? His laughter returned, brittle this time, echoing more like glass than thunder. David's lips pressed into a firm line. His voice was calm, deliberate. My mother may clean your floors, but she never bent her back to anyone. And I am her son. That sentence landed like a strike. The words pierced deeper than any foreign tongue. dragging the truth into the light. The businessmen shifted again, some averting their eyes, others studying David with newfound curiosity. For the first time, Hassan said nothing. The city hummed beyond the windows, lights glittering like watchful eyes. Somewhere in the silence, the weight of centuries, wealth against poverty, arrogance against dignity collided. And standing at the center was David Johnson, no longer the boy mocked for his background, but the boy who forced the mighty to listen. Outside the towering windows, Manhattan glowed like a galaxy scattered across the earth. But inside that penthouse, all eyes were fixed on the boy. David's words still lingered in the air, echoing louder than Hassan's laughter ever had. A ripple of unease passed through the room. These men, who built empires on intimidation and prestige, suddenly found themselves wondering, if this boy could stand unshaken here, where else might he rise? Hassan straightened his tie, his jaw tightening. He had spent decades ensuring no one ever challenged him publicly, and certainly not in his own domain. "Enough games," he said sharply, his voice slicing through the silence. "This is business, not a classroom recital. You've shown your tricks, but they change nothing. You're still a child." David didn't flinch. He had heard those words before, from teachers who doubted him, from neighbors who whispered he'd never escape his circumstances. But every dismissal had become fuel, every doubt a spark to push him further. His mother's tired face rose again in his mind, and with it, her quiet resilience. "I may be young," David said, his tone deliberate, "but knowledge has no age. Dignity has no price. And languages connect the world you think you own." For a moment, even the city seemed to pause. The businessmen glanced at one another, their faces betraying something they would never admit aloud: respect. Hassan's smirk faltered, but his pride was too steep to allow silence. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "And what will you do with your words, boy? Quote poetry to the hungry? Speak French to the poor? Tell me, what empire will you build with your mother's mop and your 9 languages?" David's answer was steady, sharp as steel. "I'll build the kind of empire you'll never understand. One that doesn't begin with greed and end with chains." The words landed with precision, a blade against Hassan's arrogance. One of the businessmen exhaled sharply, as if struck by the truth. Another, older and quieter, murmured, "He speaks like a leader." The tension thickened, pulsing through the room. Hassan's kingdom of marble and glass suddenly felt smaller, less secure. The boy he had mocked was not retreating, he was advancing, step by step with nothing but his voice. And Hassan, though he tried to laugh again, could not disguise the unease creeping into his chest. For the first time in years, he had met an opponent who could not be bought, bent, or silenced. The air grew heavier, as though the penthouse itself strained under the collision of pride and resolve. Hassan shifted in his seat, crossing one leg over the other, pretending at ease. Yet his knuckles whitened where they gripped the armrest. His empire had been built on dominance, on the certainty that wealth commanded respect. But here was a boy, a janitor's son, dismantling that illusion one sentence at a time. David's gaze wandered briefly across the glittering skyline, the skyscrapers gleaming like towers of ambition. He wondered how many of those buildings were built by men who never set foot inside them, men like his mother who toiled unseen. And then he looked back at Hassan, whose very presence reeked of entitlement. "You think money makes you invincible?" David said softly, his words carrying further than their volume should allow. "But money can't teach you how to listen. It can't buy respect. And it can't erase the truth." The businessmen shifted uneasily. One adjusted his cufflinks, another avoided David's eyes altogether. They were men accustomed to numbers, contracts, and power plays. But this confrontation was something different, something raw. It wasn't about balance sheets. It was about dignity. Hassan barked a laugh, desperate to reclaim control. "Truth?" he scoffed. "Truth is whatever the powerful decide it is. Do you think the world listens to cleaners and their children? The world listens to men like me." He spread his arms wide, as though the towering penthouse and the city beyond confirmed his authority. But David did not retreat. He stepped closer, his voice firm, unwavering. "Then maybe it's time the world started listening to voices like mine." That single line struck harder than a shout. It was not just defiance. It was a declaration. And in that instant, The boy who entered as a guest of pity now stood as a challenger of systems. The silence stretched long. The hum of the city beyond seemed louder, as if New York itself leaned in to witness. One businessman finally broke, whispering under his breath, "He's right." Another nodded faintly, though fear kept him silent. For Hassan, the cracks widened. His smirk faltered into something more dangerous. A glare, cold and sharp. "Be careful, boy," he warned. "The world doesn't forgive arrogance." David's lips curved, not in arrogance, but in quiet conviction. "Neither do I." The room shivered. For the first time, Hassan realized he wasn't speaking to a child at all. He was staring at the future, a future he could no longer laugh away. The skyline outside gleamed brighter, as though the city itself recognized the shift inside the room. Hassan al-Mansuri's eyes narrowed, his authority slipping like sand through his fingers. Around him, the businessmen sat trapped between loyalty to wealth and admiration for truth. They had followed Hassan's power for years. But now their gazes flickered toward the boy, as if searching for something Hassan could not give them. David, sensing the moment, did not press with arrogance. Instead, he let silence linger, a silence that forced reflection. His mother had always told him that silence could be louder than words if held with courage. Tonight, that silence wrapped itself around the room like an iron chain. Finally, one of the men spoke, his voice hesitant. "The boy's right. Words do build empires. Every treaty, every alliance, every contract begins with language." His statement trembled at the edges, but the truth within it was undeniable. Hassan's glare sliced toward the man, silencing him instantly. But the damage was done. The first thread of loyalty had loosened. David turned, addressing not just Hassan, but the room itself. "You sit here at the top of the world, convinced money is your fortress. But history doesn't remember the richest. It remembers those who changed lives. Language is how we connect, how we rise together. It's the bridge across every border you build with your wealth." The words struck deeper than any insult. Even those who came to sip whiskey and nod at Hassan's jokes now found themselves leaning forward, captivated. David's voice carried no wealth, no status, but it carried truth. And truth was rare in rooms like this. Hassan's composure cracked further. He slammed his palm on the glass table, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "Enough!" he roared. "You are a boy, a janitor's son. Do not mistake parlor tricks for power." But the anger betrayed him. Power did not roar, it whispered. And tonight David was the one whispering. Calmly, the boy met his glare. "Power isn't what you take from others. It's what you give them. My mother gave me strength, knowledge, the ability to speak across nations. What have you given except fear?" The question hit harder than any blow. Hassan's breath caught in his throat. Around him, the men who once laughed now sat in silence, watching him shrink beneath the weight of a boy's conviction. For the first time in his empire, Hassan was no longer the center of the room. The room pulsed with tension, every second stretching like an eternity. Hassan al-Mansuri, a man who commanded skyscrapers and silenced boardrooms, now found himself cornered not by rivals with billions, but by a boy with nothing but words. His pride wrestled with the truth. His empire of intimidation, crumbling under the gaze of men who had once sworn allegiance to his dominance. David could feel it, the shift. He was no longer speaking to Hassan alone. He was speaking to every man in that room, to every unseen ear beyond these glass walls. His voice grew steadier, more deliberate, like the ringing of a bell that could not be unheard. "My mother spent her life cleaning the floors of men who never looked her in the eye," David said. "But she gave me more than they ever could. She gave me knowledge. She gave me languages that connect me to the world you try to divide. And tonight I stand here not as a servant's son, but as proof that dignity rises where arrogance falls." The words carried weight, wrapping around each listener like a cloak of revelation. The businessmen shifted, not in discomfort now, but in contemplation. One older man leaned forward, his lined face softened by memory. "He reminds me," he whispered, almost to himself, "of when I first believed in something greater than profit." Hassan's fists clenched, veins standing out against his skin. He felt the ground slipping. The respect he had commanded with fear dissolving into fragile silence. Desperation twisted his voice as he tried to reclaim the room. "Do not be fooled," he snapped. "The world does not bend for speeches. It bends for money, for power, for bloodlines. This boy will return to his broken apartment while we continue to rule." But even as he spoke, the words rang hollow. The grandeur of his penthouse could not mask the cracks forming in his authority. David's reply was soft, but it struck like thunder. "Then perhaps your rule is ending." The silence that followed was unlike the others. This was not the silence of shock or hesitation. It was the silence of realization. The silence of men who had seen a truth too clear to ignore. Hassan's gaze darted across the room, searching for support, but found only eyes that had turned elsewhere. Eyes drawn to the boy who had dared to stand, to speak, to defy. In that moment, the mighty Arab millionaire understood. The most terrifying truth of all, his empire had been shaken. Not by wealth or war, but by the voice of a janitor's son. The night pressed close against the penthouse windows, the city's lights flickering like 1,000 watching eyes. Hassan al-Mansuri sat rigid, his jaw set, his empire trembling in silence. For decades, he had measured worth in billions, respect in obedience. Yet here was David Johnson, a boy with no fortune. No title, no claim to power, and somehow he had reshaped the room. David's gaze lingered on the man who had mocked him only moments before. There was no triumph in his expression, only certainty. He had not come to win applause nor to humiliate. He had come to stand, to prove that his mother's labor, her sacrifices, her dreams poured into him, were not invisible. "I don't need your approval," David said quietly, though his words reached every corner of the room. "I only need to remind you and anyone listening that strength doesn't come from wealth. It comes from resilience, from truth, from the courage to speak when silence is easier." The businessmen lowered their eyes, some in shame, others in reverence. For years, they had laughed at Hassan's jokes, bowed to his dominance. Tonight, they had witnessed something greater. A boy too young to be bound by fear, too brave to be silenced by arrogance. Hassan said nothing. His laughter was gone, his voice stolen. He sat, a man suddenly aware that power without respect was nothing but a hollow crown. David turned toward the door, his worn backpack still slung across one shoulder. He did not look back. He didn't need to. The silence behind him told the story. The boy had entered as the son of a cleaning lady, but he left as something greater, proof that dignity, spoken in any language, could shake the foundations of empires.